as the people who have tuned in to listen can hear, your work, it runs a broad spectrum from activism to research to promotion. These are all such important things. It's really clear that you're all advancing really important work to make active transportation safer, more inclusive, and to make more people think about it as an option. I'd like to ask each of you, and we'll mix it up. Ahmed, I'll give you the warning. I'm going to ask you first. We're going to go in reverse order, Ahmed, and then Chris, and then Army. But if you could each share a project or a concept and a notion that you feel has really helped to move the needle and help to implement better active transportation practices in the world. And Ahmed, if you wouldn't mind going ahead.
Okay. I'll jump in. I'll give you two examples that were nice and interesting that happened. In my active transportation class, I give the students the opportunity to work with real world projects and problems. And we were approached by the Collation Vélo Montréal, telling us there's a dangerous intersection in Montreal and they need to change this intersection and come up with new ideas for it. So what we did is that we gave that as an assignment to the students, and then the students came up with various ideas. So I have like 16 students, and all the students agreed to share their ideas with the Collation Vélo Montréal, and through the collaboration with them, Collation succeeded to push it further and get it implemented, get some of the ideas the students came up from the class implemented. So this, I feel, was like a good example of where we succeeded to switch the needle to have more bicycle safety in a way where the Collation was looking for someone to help them, and we came there as a university, offered the solutions and the options, and we did that together. And the city ended up listening to them. Then that was the nice thing at the end, that some of the students saw some of the ideas they drew on a piece of paper implemented on there. Same thing happened with what's their name, with Quebec City. They came to us. They said we need to do a new bicycle plan, and you come up with your plan, we come up with our plan, and then we compare. And we succeeded with them to include equity aspects in the plan, in the cycling plan. And Jean-François Martel there was very open, and he didn't share his plan with us. We came with the students with a plan and where to build new bicycle facilities in there with our criteria. And at the end, we shared and felt, oh, there's a match there. So that helped in pushing, and we went and presented it to the city council to help him. And he got some of these new bicycle facilities implemented in Quebec City.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ahmed. Chris, what has moved the needle? What the project or idea has changed things from your perspective?
Yeah, I think the first thing that we always do when we're approached by a new city is to really encourage them to start thinking at the network level, to think bigger than individual incidents and opportunities, single corridors or intersections, and take the kind of 10,000-foot view that connects a complete minimum grid of cycling routes. They're maybe not all segregated. They could be some traffic calm routes, some low stress routes, but trying to connect all the possible origins and destinations in your city. So not just the office spaces with the residential areas, but thinking about the schools, thinking about the restaurants, cafes, the public spaces, the community centers. And the Dutch have really done this incredibly well, is thinking at the network level in terms of the cohesion of the network, the directness of the network, and then making sure that safety, comfort, and attractiveness are key principles that you build in so that it becomes the first choice to nudge people towards cycling. And you're not going to capture all short car trips within a city, but if you build your network properly, then you may get 20% of car trips, short car journeys, switching over to the bicycle. And that's really what we're aiming for, is capturing these short car journeys within a city. And it's something that cities like Calgary, Edmonton, Vancouver, Victoria have started to do, is building out in not just individual cycle tracks, but minimum grids, networks, and in some instances like Calgary and Edmonton doing it very quickly.
Amazing when those things all come together and you can finally see the pieces click into place and a network emerges. That's a beautiful moment. Okay, Army, you're up. I think you understand the question. I won't repeat it. Over to you.
So before I talk about stuff that we've worked on, I want to first acknowledge that The town of Ajax actually used a study by Dr. El Ghanady on the different cyclist typologies. So we use that for our wayfinding strategies. So that's another example on the impact from McGill University. All right, so now Ajax. We have our integrated transportation master plan, which was passed by council in 2019. And that lays out the minimum grid, which includes a lot of lower stress networks. So bike facilities that are separated from the road. And it also acknowledges not just infrastructure, but also programming to a certain extent. So the second project I want to mention is our transportation awareness campaign called Get Ajax Moving. And it's really done a good job of building up the momentum for active transportation. We could plan all these policies and all these designs and stuff like that, but people always mention, oh, but there's this need for political will, and it has to serve the needs of the community. So through Get Ajax Moving, which has been implemented since about 2016, we've been really able to understand our residents better. So it's community engagement by showing up at various popular community events where we get to meet families and get to see people who wouldn't necessarily show up, who wouldn't have the capacity to show up at a typical public consultation. And an example of an event within Get Ajax Moving is TrailFest. So TrailFest is an event where we bike around the town and get to show residents the different bike facilities available. And there's also walks that happen at on that same day. During that event, we have a ride that's actually led by the mayor, and we also get council to come as well. And council has expressed a lot of positive comments about the event and a greater appreciation for the trails as well as the bike facilities available. So I think I'll leave it there. Well, I guess it's also worth mentioning that we also engage residents in that campaign throughout the winter. And it's interesting to find that during our winter engagement activities, our most popular resource is our biking toolkit, oddly enough. So that's how I'd say those two projects. We have the policy, the plan in place with the minimum grid, and we also have that engagement piece where we get to build that momentum and better understand residents, what they need, and to build that relationship with them.
That's fantastic, Army. And to all of you, I was on a panel yesterday and we were talking about the importance of budgets. Yeah, keep your camera on, that's good. And you know, we can all make the most wonderful plans that we can conceive of, but until their funding turns up in a budget, they're not really real, are they? So for you, Army, to have gotten the council and the mayor out there on bikes, and to have the mayor leading a bike ride, I think showing them firsthand is really smart, and in a very productive way to get your projects onto the council agenda. So well done there. And I was wondering, Ahmed, Army seems to really like McGill. Maybe she was your student. I'm not sure. Army, did you go to McGill? You're just a fan, maybe.
I went to McGill, but I wasn't a student, but I still use his research.
Okay, very good. But I was going to say to Ahmed, for you to be able to put students in a position of influencing public policy is a remarkable gift for you to give them so effectively. So congratulations on that. You're setting them on a remarkable trajectory in their careers, which I'm sure is going to be very gratifying for them. And then Chris, throughout our engagement on the active transportation strategy, this idea of connecting the different uses, you know, schools to residential districts to main streets, parks, came up again and again, and it created an interesting discussion in which we could see some people using their voice to say we should really be directing the funding to communities who have done that work, who can show that they've got a good plan for connectivity. Whereas another voice was emerging that said we really need to be giving this money to communities who haven't even knocked on the door of active transportation yet, to help them to get started, to step across the threshold. In the end, of course, we're going to be trying to balance both. But that was an example of some of the barriers that people were bringing up through our conversations. You know, how does a community really get started if they're not there already? So I wanted to ask you each about that question about barriers. And what is it that you see that is keeping us from making better progress? Or is there some interminable or unfixable challenge that you're facing in your particular work that other people might have a suggestion to get past? But anything at all about the barriers that you're overcoming and how you're addressing those? And let's swing back and go through the order in the reverse way again. And Army, so we'll start with you.
Sure. So it's interesting. I learned from Shannon Holness, who was also featured in CIP's last issue, Plan Canada issue, that us planners, we're conditioned to look at things through a deficit lens. And what ends up happening in that process is we overlook the community strengths that are taking place, those opportunities within the community. If we don't consider those strengths and opportunities, then we risk potentially harming those communities regardless of whatever tool in our toolbox that we have. So regardless of how beneficial active transportation can be generally, we need to consider about the needs of the community as well as their achievements, their leadership, their contributions and such. So in Ajax, the way we have been trying to better understand the community, I already mentioned Get Ajax Moving, but we also work with different departments. So with our economic development division, we've been engaging businesses. With our library, we've been able to reach more populations as well. And we're in touch with our accessibility coordinator and our diversity and inclusion coordinator. I sit on the age-friendly committee, and through being on that committee, we've actually been able to do a pop-up event at the Welcome Center to engage newcomers. So that's been great. In terms of understanding the community more, I'd also like to add that for me, at least for me personally, I don't know how it is for other active transportation professionals, but when it comes to hearing perspectives from people with disabilities, I tend to only hear from people with disabilities who drive or who walk. So we hear about different conflicts between those types of mode users as well as cyclists, but I never really get the chance to hear from people with disabilities who may use adaptive bikes or adaptive scooters. So I feel like us as a profession, as a planning profession, as a transportation profession, could do better in that interdisciplinary collaboration to find out how we can better serve the needs of people with disabilities who use various active transportation modes.
All right, thank you for that. Chris, reflections on challenges that you may have faced at the City of Vancouver or that you face in your work at the embassy?
Yeah, I think we often emphasize that the barriers are not necessarily technical or engineering based, they're almost always political. And with all due respect to you, Andy, the politician, the status quo is a very enticing thing. They often don't like to put their neck out and lean into something that's deemed controversial, even if it isn't. And unfortunately, when we see with the reallocation of road space, when we start talking about removing parking or travel lanes, a controversy is manufactured, whether it's reflective of the community or not. And so the media will grasp a hold of it, a couple of vocal critics will get a hold of it, and the politician will, well, back down or water down the proposal or, not necessarily proceed. And so anything we can do as advocates, as professionals, to give them cover, to help them understand that largely 60 to 70% of their city probably endorses this. They want a more walkable, bikeable community. This controversy is worth pushing through to get to the other side, because once you start building this infrastructure, people start using it, your city becomes a more equitable, sustainable, resilient place. The struggle was worth it, but there's really kind of a bit of a blockage there in terms of leading into that controversy. And so whatever we can do, whether it's engaging with the community, those that aren't out there actively lobbying for active travel, giving voices to those people. One thing we do at the Dutch Cycling Embassy is bringing politicians for study tours of the Netherlands, just to show them what's possible and help see and stir their imaginations. And that has been successful in terms of securing commitment to active travel projects. But the politicians need our support and security, and so we should be really focusing our energy on them to make sure that they will go through with the plans that are put on paper.
Well, thanks for that. And before we come to Ahmed, I just want to dwell on that one for a minute, if I could. I'm glad that you raised this, because it really is true and it's really important. Before I became an elected person in 2015, I'm a city planner and a member of the CIP for 20 or more years. And in those 20 years, spent a long time giving elected representatives the cover that you're talking about, building programs that they could see were supported broadly by the community. So I wanted to make sure we uncovered that, and I'm glad that you did. That the work of advocacy, whether you're on staff or in academia or just in the community, a big part of that is articulating community desire to elected people so that they can better understand what the community wants, and as in your words, to give them cover. And it's interesting for me not to be on the other side of that line. And I always say that a good planner is always a little bit subversive, you know, and knows how to sort of get things done in a clever way. And Army's doing it by bringing her council and mayor on bike rides and so forth. And this is very important. Okay, Ahmed, about barriers, what can you share with us?
So I would echo Chris about the politics a little bit, a lot. But if I would look at Montreal today, or I look at many places, it's misinformation. There's a lot of misinformation about when you use active transportation. So we are going to build a bicycle lane here in Montreal. It's the end of the world for the businesses. Actually, it's not. All the research recently has been showing that when you take out 26 parking spots and you're leaving 300, so you're not going to kill the businesses. Actually, you'll find that these people are coming and using things and spending, and they are striving. There hasn't been any evidence about that. So there's a lot of misinformation goes on, that this is like we're doing this because it's a war on the cause. You're putting this funding because you're against the cause. No, you're not against the cause, but you're pro the other things as well. You're trying to make sure everybody's happy and improve the quality of life of everybody. So how the communication part is being held, because this, when the misinformation is being put there, okay, then you find more pressure on the politics, that you not only have to support the project or support the fund you're putting towards the active transport, you actually have to defend the misinformation first, to say like, actually I'm spending on the right thing to improve the quality of life, and rather than thinking of, okay, what are the major concepts and the good things I could do with this money. So the misinformation, I think, is a major challenge here in Montreal. I've seen it in Toronto, I've seen it in many places around the world, where they think not the right information is being communicated. And so then also one of the other challenges I felt is like some disconnect in some projects. So we've invested in Montreal on the REM, and then we don't build the bicycling access to the REM station, for example, or one of the REM stations. We don't really think of some of the accesses in details for some stations, and then we go after the fact and we try to fix that later on. So these are things that I think also that when we think about some of the projects, we don't think integratively of all the modes accessing the new infrastructure. So that's also a major challenge we see in active transportation, is that we build a piece here, piece here, piece here, and then not something as a network. So these are two things I feel that are big challenges now.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Fascinating. I'm glad you mentioned this, the myth of bike lanes that displace parking as being harmful to local business. It is a myth, and I have in my career tried to find any evidence to support the claims of business improvement areas that it's bad for business, and never could. All the evidence points to the opposite, in fact, that you have people moving by in greater numbers at a slower speed, greater ability to hop off their bike and pop in. Bike parking is more plentiful than car parking anyway. Every metric points to that. So thanks for uncovering that. I just want to take a moment to remind our wonderful attendees today to drop any questions at all you have in the chat function there on your screen. We are going to reserve some time at the end to address your questions, and you can ask them generally to all of the panelists, or you could put somebody on a hot seat, whatever you would like. So so please do keep those questions coming along. Now I have another question for the panelists. You know, Canada is a huge country. It's a remarkable country. It's enormous. And it's really like many countries in one, isn't it? Rural and remote communities, east, west, central, farmland, coastal communities, dense, not dense. Our communities are wildly different. So it's not always easy to import experiences from countries like Netherlands or like UK, because the physical arrangement of communities tends to be quite different. However, there is a lot to learn still from programs and successes outside of Canada. Chris, you might be in kind of the best position here because of your work, but and I'll start with you, Chris. Can you share some examples or lessons from outside of Canada that would land particularly well with us at this, what I really think is an inflection point in the way that Canadians are looking at active transportation, experiences that can really push us over the line and have us get that big modal shift that we were trying to get. And yeah, Chris, if we could start with you.
Yeah, so we've had a lot of conversations with US and Canadian cities, and it is, you're right, trying to find that common ground, that practical lessons from this small, kind of monotonous, flat, densely built country. But there are two that we always come back to, and the first is not looking at active travel in and of itself, but combining it with public transportation to get the biggest bang for your buck. So one thing the Dutch do remarkably well here, and you see the sea of bicycles, parked bicycles at the train stations, is use the cycling network to feed more passengers into their public transport system, and thus putting more bicycles on the cycleways. So there's this virtuous circle that takes place between the cycling infrastructure, secure parking at the transit hubs, and then a last mile solution that's provided at the other end of the train or bus trip, that allows for the same door-to-door convenience of the car over longer distances, sometimes 100 kilometers between cities, all without needing the private car. And so that's one thing that I think we can do quite well. And Vancouver is admittedly doing that itself in terms of building secure parking at the SkyTrain stations, and then using bike share as a last mile solution. The second thing I'll mention really quickly is the mass uptake of electric cycling here. And the e-bike, despite the fact that this country's as flat as a pancake, it's actually the biggest e-bike market in the world per capita. And it's actually, e-bikes have outsold traditional bicycles for the past 2 years in a row. And that's because it's not being necessarily used as a speed enhancer, but a range extender. And so people with less physical ability, definitely older people, are traveling further and further distances, sometimes 7, 8, 10 kilometers, because the electric bike gives them that extra support. But it does mean that we have to start designing our infrastructure a little more forgiving, a little more inclusively, and providing extra space for the e-bikes mixing in with other types of cycling. But we definitely see the electric bike in other contexts that are hillier, spread further apart, the weather's maybe not as great, as this great equalizer that can knock down some of those localized geographic and weather barriers.
I'm really glad you mentioned e-bikes. That I'm not sure, we probably all spend too much time on Twitter. I certainly do, paying attention to our peers talking about active transportation. But it seems to me that there is an e-bike revolution underway in Canada. People are asking for it. E-bikes, cargo bikes, e-cargo bikes. I'm looking out my window here in Halifax at our downtown streets, and anybody who's been in Halifax knows the hilly nature of our downtown. There are streets here that would not be approved for construction under contemporary engineering standards. They're so steep, and those hills are a barrier for uptake for AT in Halifax. We got a new premier about 2 months ago, and one of the first thing that he did was to introduce a provincial e-bike rebate program, and it has inspired me or redoubled my efforts to work on the same in the federal government. So that work is ongoing, but. Thank you for that, for raising it again, because the more we talk about it, the more likely it is to become real. Ahmed, would you like to share any thoughts on learning from abroad and how that could help Canada?
I'd like to learn from inside. I'll tell you, I'll give you there's a lot of good things that we are doing in Montreal, and we are doing in Vancouver, and we're doing in Toronto. We need to be able to look at what we have done. So, for example, the Réseau Express Vélo in Montreal, the REV, it was built with a certain design. It has been very successful. We built the sanitary corridors, and many people thought that like they're going to stay. We want to keep them, these sanitary corridors, when we were trying to get people to do physical distancing here in Montreal. So we have been doing a lot of good things that I think if we look inside, we can learn from what we have done. And we had some projects in Montreal that were controversial and not successful. Vancouver, they had an excellent work, like opening some streets for cycling, that I think it has been very successful, and the number of people, and we have been used worldwide as examples of the success of the sanitary corridors. Then in the recent study by Ralph Buller and John Pooker, they just released it recently, and they showed that Montreal, and they even put a picture from Montreal as a good example, that we had a lot of success of bringing people on their bikes when we open things. So I think we should be pushing more, the same way you are putting the funds. We should be pushing the provinces to put some more funds as well, and pushing everybody to put more funds, because they were successful, and we need to build a network. So I'm happy with what we're doing, but I think we can do more. But if we keep going in that direction, I would say we're doing great, but we need to push in that direction more as a network.
Okay, thank you for those reflections. I liked that you brought it back to Canada and the Made in Canada responses. Thanks for that, Ahmed. Army, is there something that you have seen or experienced abroad that you would like to transplant back here that could help us to do our jobs better?
So I agree that integration with public transit would be incredibly useful, especially in the town of Ajax, where a lot of residents work outside of Ajax and use the GO train and transit. I also agree that there's a lot that we could learn within Canada itself. So I just want to add my yes and by saying that there are certain considerations that we have to take every time we see this new intervention that seems like we could benefit from. So we have to be mindful of Canada's history of extracting land from Indigenous people, and also using various types of planning and transportation projects to destroy communities, whether that was intentional or not. So that includes using car-oriented development to remove communities like Africville in Nova Scotia, or Hogan's Alley in Vancouver. So that's something that we have to keep in mind. It's important that we really work with the communities and to understand those different systems of oppression that come at play. I'm finding that in the US, they have, granted, there's obviously some examples that we want to steer away from, but there's also a lot of really good examples of how they look at equity, how they engage with residents. And a couple examples that I could think of off the top of my head are the work done by the Thrivance Group. I invite you to check them out. They also teach a course about dignity-infused community engagement, so I encourage you to check that out. And also there's a nonprofit called MOGO in Detroit that offers a program with adaptive bikes for people with disabilities. So in short, I think that it's important that we contextualize it within our very uncomfortable history here in this country, but also use it as an opportunity for collective healing.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Interesting perspectives on all around. So I will say that those are the 4 questions that we had that I wanted to launch our conversation with. We've had some really good response from attendees here. So I'm gonna start posing some questions from the questions box, and panelists, you may be able to see that in your menu bar there. It's called questions and a little down arrow. You could view some of the questions there. And I would invite panelists to even approach this as kind of more of a informal discussion. So I might pose it to one of you, but I invite anyone else to sort of jump in or wave to the camera, and we'll start to let this be more of an organic conversation. I think would be nice. So the first question I want to ask is something actually that Army touched on, which is how can we get active transportation going in the winter months? Thank you, Jennifer Smith, for that answer, that question rather.
Is that for me to clarify?
Yeah, you want to take a stab at that? You had mentioned it earlier, and pass it off to anybody.
So there's many ways of going about that. Here in the town of Ajax, we receive lots of concerns about the conditions of the sidewalks, about how they're icy and slippery and such. So this year, we've actually been able to increase budget for snow removal on roads as well as sidewalks. So that's the first step. And we even have a map of trails that are maintained during the winter as well. Maintenance is part of the picture. Another thing that I did was in a couple of videos where I talked about active transportation in the winter, I also mentioned ways that you can do it comfortably. So I mentioned things like using boot grips that can stick to ice. And in some of our other promotional materials, I mentioned ice cleats as well as snowshoes. So there's a variety of ways to go about that. And so far, it's been interesting. There's quite a few people who do walk in the winter. I've noticed that when I was biking on the trails last winter, there were more people biking than I thought, which was pretty interesting. There's this common misconception that people don't walk or bike in the winter, so I think that's something worth unpacking, of course. But it's important that we understand that winter walking is a way to connect to the land, and it's really an opportunity to connect to the land and get to know our communities and each other.
That's fantastic. Would anybody like to jump in and add anything to that?
The main thing that people, when we talk about winter cycling, it's always about saying you need just to know how to wear and what to wear and make yourself comfortable. And so it's more about what you're wearing, because there are many northern countries where they face the same cold weather that we face, but they're still cycling all year long. So why? It's because people know what to wear and how to feel comfortable, and the city is putting and municipalities are putting the resources to clean up the snow. So as what Army was saying, in some cities we have the white network in Montreal that to make sure that these are always clean from the snow. We invest in cleaning the sidewalks, but want to make sure that people actually know how to wear and what to wear to be comfortable. So we might need to jump into education a little bit to make sure that we can get people. And then when you see people on the streets cycling, you will jump on your bicycle. And this is what we have been seeing with the COVID. There's a lot of new people who jumped on bicycles. Now, if you want to buy a bicycle, it's 3-month wait, I think, or 4 months in some places, which is great. But I think we need to keep these people. So to keep them and keep going with that momentum is to educate people of how to, like, you need studded tires. You can't do the regular tire in the winter. So some education might help there to people.
Okay, Chris, did you want to jump in? I'm not pressuring you, but if you had something, please.
No, it's admittedly even an area that the Dutch don't get perfectly, but if you are interested in this topic, there is an excellent organization, the Winter Cycling Federation, and they host an annual event every February called the Winter Cycling Congress. I've attended the past 2 years, and it's really a fantastic exchange of ideas and best practice that I would encourage people to investigate.
Well, thanks for that. It's interesting. It came up during our national engagement on the active transportation strategy, this whole concept of keeping the AT trails accessible and usable all winter, all year round, 12 months of the year. One of the challenges that we're trying to overcome is that the funding is really capital funding to build infrastructure, and the winter operations and maintenance is really an operational matter, and it's hard to mix operating funds with capital funds. And so we're trying to figure out what we can do to help communities with winter maintenance. So stay tuned on that one. This is a nice segue into another question, perhaps. But as I mentioned at one point earlier, there are communities in Canada that are well established with their active transportation intentions. There are those who are just starting to wake up to it and are looking for a way in. So on that second kind of community, what are some quick wins or suggestions you might have for smaller, rural, northern, Indigenous communities that are trying to crack into active transportation? Something to put in the community quickly to show that it can really work. And I'll just put it right out there if anybody has thoughts, anything at all.
I can jump in. Paint.
Please.
Paint, just a bucket of paint and quick testing, and similar to what we did in the physical distancing in many places across Canada, that we test things. Put some paint. You don't need to build the very big concrete barrier and you just do some paint and then some poles of separations, very little. So cheap, quick bicycle lanes, well designed, and then make sure the paint is like at the intersection, you paint it well to separate, to show the separation so the car users get used to it. And then it's not wrong to say that this pilot didn't work. Okay, so if you put some paint, so you didn't invest a lot, but if it works, then now you can make it permanent and keep it for forever, and try in another section and keep moving. So I would say what I've been seeing in many places is the trial pilot thing helps, and the paint is cheap. It's not that expensive.
Thanks, Ahmed. I agree with you. I mean, we started our journey to separated bike lanes here in Halifax with paint, and you know, it has a lot of drawbacks. In fact, just this morning, I saw a tweet in all caps that said, "Paint is not infrastructure," but sometimes it does help to get us where we're going, right?
Yeah, if you succeed, if the paint one succeeds, then build the big one and apply to the funds for the $400 million to make it permanent.
Yeah, exactly. Jeremy, you sat forward there at one point. Did you want to add anything?
Yes. So I think what we could learn from the Town of Ajax Get Ajax Moving campaign is engaging residents. And I guess an affordable way to do that is by just engaging residents at existing popular events and trying to find out and understand residents, how residents move around, what places bring a good amount of meaning to them, what places do they want to avoid or make them feel unsafe, show them different options. So I don't have the time to explain it here because I feel like I could give a whole workshop on it. But a couple techniques that I use are one that's called motivational interviewing. That's based off of a counseling method. So I use techniques in that to, in a very non-judgmental way, better understand what residents' motivations are, what their ability is, and really it's just a way of being curious and finding out what opportunities are available given whatever circumstance that they have. And that might look like being able to walk to the store once a month or something like that. It might be something that small, or it might be someone saying, oh, actually, I prefer going to the GO train instead of driving to Mississauga. Somewhere that's 20, 40 kilometers away. So by listening to people in a very curious and non-judgmental way, you'll actually receive some really interesting responses that you wouldn't have thought of. And then I also think it's worth using techniques from copywriting. So from sales copywriting, I've learned different ways of connecting to people's values. But in order to do that, you have to understand what different target audiences are out there. And you have to choose a target audience that isn't being served by active transportation currently. So to help feed into the target audience, one step as a starting point is to look at Dr. El Ghanaidy's article on the different cyclist typologies, but it's also important to look at the demographics of the area and to connect with community leaders, as well as staff who probably do engage with the community who you're targeting.
Okay, well, thank you for that. There are some great questions coming from the attendees here. I'm going to drop one in here. This is from David, who asks, any examples of using smart city technologies to integrate transit with active transportation? Maybe I'll even open up that more broadly. Just smart cities technologies in the AT world. Are we seeing that anywhere? There's a very active Twitter account in Halifax. I feel like I'm talking about Twitter too much. Probably I am, but it's not a person. It's actually the bike counters. So the bike counters report once a day on the number of bikes that went by on each of the main routes. It's very telling. You can see it changing, the numbers changing based on the weather, based on winter maintenance as well. There's data being collected. Interesting to see what we can then do with that data. But anybody want to share anything on smart city technology? Okay, well, I guess I answered that question. Maybe we'll mark that as something that we need to learn more about and investigate more thoroughly. Data.
That's an area for improvement.
That's exactly right. The smart use of data did come up very much in the consultation that we did, the national consultation. So to make sure that we're doing data-driven decisions. Somebody is asking about, it's a very specific question. This one comes from Felipe, who would like to modify an existing roundabout to make it great for cyclists, and wondering if someone can point to a roundabout in the world that where cyclists are safe and it work well with vehicles.
Chris can point to like 700 around him.
Every single roundabout in this country. No, I mean, it's one thing that another area where the Dutch really excel is the creation of roundabouts that prioritize and protect both cyclists and pedestrians around their perimeter. And I mean, where to start on that conversation? It's all done through traffic calming. So drivers are brought in at a 45-degree angle. The approach is kept narrow, sorry, a 90-degree angle. The approach is kept narrow. They're forced to make eye contact with the vulnerable road users, yield to the vulnerable road users in most cases in built-up areas, and it results in this very kind of free-flowing but safe situation that's actually been statistically shown to be more safe than a traffic light or a signalized intersection. We've published on our YouTube channel a knowledge clip that explains the Dutch approach to roundabouts that I can direct you towards. If you look Dutch Cycling Embassy on YouTube, you can find an 8-minute explainer video on protected roundabouts as a concept.
Felipe, I think you got a good answer there, and thank you for asking the question. It grieves me to say we've run out of time. There are a number of wonderful questions that folks have answered there. CIP has your questions. We'll see what can be done with them. But I'm going to have to wrap it up here. I have a couple of closing things to say that for this on behalf of the CIP. But I just want to repeat to you the 5 things that I really heard coming through our conversation today. One is around inclusivity and equality and equity. So this is clearly a topical concept that we're all thinking about now. Another theme was engagement, deep, authentic engagement, listening to community, going to where community is to hear their ideas and honoring the wisdom and experience of community members. We heard about demonstration, the power of demonstration projects, even though paint's not infrastructure. Sometimes just showing people what is possible with a cheap and cheerful project, a tactical urbanism project, can go a long way. This notion of connectivity, of making the most of our investments in AT infrastructure to make usable, productive, coherent minimum grids, very important. And then the last one was this notion of bringing the deciders along, bringing elected people or other, the director of planning or whoever it is along on your journey to make sure that they buy into the programs that you're all putting forward. So I want to say first, before we go, CIP's next webinar takes place on June 22nd and 23rd. This is going to celebrate National Indigenous History Month and will honor the history, heritage, and diversity of Indigenous peoples in Canada. That webinar is going to center on Indigenous knowledge and experiences in planning practice, and all the information you need to join that is on CIP's website. The second to last thing, this June, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation launches round 2 of the Housing Supply Challenge. The Getting Started round invites interdisciplinary groups to develop locally relevant solutions to build affordable housing. Successful submissions will receive up to $100,000 in funding to prototype or incubate their proposal. And for more information on that, take a look at cmhc.ca/housing supply challenge. And lastly, thanks to all of the attendees who tuned in to share their time and their thoughtful questions with us. Thank you so much. You make these webinars what they are. And finally, thank you to the panelists for making time and sharing all of your wonderful experiences. It's absolutely wonderful to connect with you. And I hope that we all get a chance to see each other in person before too much longer. Keep up your incredible work. You're changing the world. And it's been a pleasure to spend this time with you today. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks.